Hi guys, so welcome to the third of your Excel workshops. This week we're going to add to last week's workshop on central tendencies by talking about measures of dispersion. We're going to complete the graphs that we started last week, and I will also try to demonstrate some of the principles that we talked about in terms of when to use medians or when to use means and the dispersions that go with those, depending on whether you have outliers in the data set. Okay, so starting with the tree data that has been collected during the data collection valley, where we have calculated in the same transects for every group of students the number of trees within that transect, which was around the lake, trees that had ivy growing on them and trees that didn't have ivy growing on them. So as always, I'd like to first tidy up this data set a little bit. So I'd like you to delete the data rows that are empty. So these are for groups which either didn't exist or who didn't enter the data in the first place. So starting with this first one here that doesn't have anything written in these two cells, we highlight the whole row as I showed you before, so that we don't disconnect any of this information in the other ones. We highlight the whole row by clicking onto the row identifier 5. We then right click and delete. Okay, now we scroll down a little bit. There's a few down here that we need to delete, so highlight the way I showed you before, the way that you highlight all of the rows, right click somewhere in that and delete. And then there's one last one here that we also want to get rid of, as well as this very last row. Okay, so now the data is tidy, we can start doing some stuff with it. And what I'd like to show you today, first of all, is how to calculate the standard deviation. Now in the lecture, we calculated or determined interquartile ranges and ranges, and I previously got you to calculate averages and determine medians, but what we didn't do was calculate a standard deviation, just because the sort of process is a little bit more complicated than what I would usually expect you to do in a lecture. But as promised, I want to do this with you in this workshop, and we'll do it by hand, which means we'll do all of the different steps of the calculation using Excel, and then I'll show you a shortcut afterwards. Okay, so just for ease of doing this, we're going to calculate first of all the average of the trees, the tree counts with no ivy growing on them, and then we're going to calculate the standard deviation. Okay, so what we need to do is first of all get the average. Okay, and usually I do that underneath the row of data that I want to calculate the average for. So I'll click on this cell, and the average, I showed you this last time, is we use equals to tell Excel that we're going to put a formula into the cell now, and then the formula is called average, open bracket, highlight all these cells, and then close bracket and press enter. So the average tree number that people counted with no ivy growing on them was 42.63 roughly. Okay, so that's our value right here, and we're going to need that for the standard deviation. So as I've explained previously, the standard deviation is the average distance of each value from this mean. And if you remember, in the formula, the first step that we needed to do was to take away the mean from each of the values. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to do, and that's called the deviations, okay, of each of the values. So I'm going to do that using Excel. So in the first cell, that's the first ivy count here of group A, we're going to do equals, and then we will take that value here, and we're going to subtract from that the mean, this one right here. Okay, press enter, there you go. That's your value. That's 63 minus the mean. Now we want to do that for all of the other cells as well. And I showed you before how you can drag formulas so that Excel does that automatically. So if you take this little plus sign on the bottom right hand corner of the cell and you drag this down, Excel should use the same calculation, but what it does, and I showed you this before, is it changes the selection of the cells. So it's moved down the selection of the first cell that I want to subtract from D2 down to D4, but it's also changed the selection for this cell right here. Okay, so it's moved this one 2 down as well. And you hopefully remember how you can tell Excel not to do that using the dollar signs. Okay, so in order for that not to happen, because we always want to use cell D37, which is where the average of this data set is, we're just going to lock this in place using the dollar signs. And I want to do that here just for both the columns, which is D, and the rows, which is 37. Okay, so if we press enter now, this result stays the same. But if I now drag this formula down, okay, it'll always subtract from whatever the number is on this, in this column, it'll subtract the average from all of them. Okay, so we can do that now and drag this whole thing all the way down to the bottom. Okay, so now we have the deviations, so the distances or differences of each of the value from the mean. Okay, now the next step in the formula is to square those deviations. Okay, so I'm just going to type in here squared, because that's what I'm going to do. So the next thing we need to do is we times each value by itself. And again, Excel can do that quite easily. I go equals, highlight this number, and then the shortcut for superscript, or for squared in this case, is if you go Shift and the number 6 on your keyboard, which gives you this little up arrow, and that tells Excel that whatever number you're going to put in now is supposed to be superscripted, okay? And in this case it's 2, because we want to square that number. Okay, so we want to times it by itself once. Okay, so that's the number squared now. And again, we can do the same as we did before and just drag this all the way down. Now Excel has squared all of these numbers. Okay. Now, in order to make this look a little bit more easy on the eye, as we've done before, I want you to change the layout, the formatting of these cells, so that they show you just 2 decimal places rather than all of these decimal places. Okay, so let's just highlight these rows down here, and instead of having the general formatting for the cell, we change it to number so that we only have a couple of decimal places here. It just makes it a little bit easier. Oops, I forgot a couple there. So let's just do that for all of these, just so it's a little bit easier to see. Okay. Now the next thing I want to do is to sum all of these up. So as well as the deviations, I want to sum up the squared deviations. And hopefully you guys remember that in order to sum something together or add something together, we use the sum function. Okay, so underneath each of these columns we go equals sum, and then we select the range we need to select. We want to include, so in this case all of these. Then we close the bracket, and then when we hit enter, the result is going to be revealed. So do this for both the deviations and the squared deviations, and then give me the results in a question, and then we will go on from there. Okay, so hopefully you all have the same result as me, which is that if you sum up all the deviations, you get a result of 0. Okay, and that's the reason why before adding these numbers together, we square them. That's exactly just how this formula works, and that's just because of the, of mathematical rules, and in order to avoid getting this 0, which we then can't perform any further calculations with. Okay, so that's why we have squared these deviations first. So we've taken each number and times it by itself, then we added them together down here, and this is the total of the squared deviations there for us. Now the next step in calculating the standard deviation is to take this these squared deviations and divide them by n-1. So that's sample size minus 1. Now, first of all, we need to know what the sample size is. So how many numbers do we have in this row? And you might remember how we can very simply just count cells using the selection tool. So if we just highlight all of the cells here in this column, we let go and it shows us that we have 35 cells here. Okay, so that means our sample size is 35. We have 35 group counts right here. And in the standard deviation, we divide the squared and added together deviations by the sample size minus 1. Okay, sample size is 35, minus 1 is 34. So our next step, and I'll do this underneath here, is equals this number divided by 34. Okay, and that gives us 220.42. That here, once we've divided the squared deviations by the sample size minus 1 is what we call the variance. Oh, can't spell. Okay, just as an aside. Okay, this value here, once we've gone to this part of the calculations, is called variance. And now the only thing left to do for us here is to take the square root of this variance, and that will then give us the standard deviation. Okay, so in this cell, I want you to perform that calculation. So it's equals, and then the shortcut in Excel for square root is SQRT. You will find this a lot actually, that the functions are sort of not written in full, so that you don't write square root, you actually write a sort of a short of it. But if you ever wonder what the function is, or whether there is a function for calculating something, remember the help function. Okay, so if you type up here square root, it will tell you, Excel will give you the right entry of the sort of help file to show you that that would be done using SQRT. And we do open bracket. We want to do the square root of this number right here, close bracket, and then when we hit enter, the standard deviation will be revealed. And as always, I would like you to give me that result, round it to 2 decimal places, and then we will go on from there. Okay, so hopefully you have the same result as me, the standard deviation for this data set. So the tree counts with no ivy growing on them is 14.85. And now I'm going to show you how you can do that same thing in literally about 2 seconds. The formula in Excel for the standard deviation is called STDEV. Okay, I'm just going to calculate that here. Here I've got the average of this range, okay, of all the trees without ivy growing on them. And underneath, I'm going to calculate the standard deviation. Excel has a formula for it, and that's STDEV. Okay, open bracket, highlight the cells, close bracket, press enter. And that's exactly the same value as what we've got here. Okay, so just change it again to 2 decimal places. And Excel has essentially done all of those steps that you've performed by hand using the different steps in the formula, and it's done it all in one go, and it spits you out the right result. And so another example of why knowing how to use Excel is really, really helpful, because it will save you a lot of time.